The sun had not yet risen when the sound of something heavy falling echoed through the valley. The desert was still cold from the night, and a soft wind moved through the tall, dry grass near the old farmhouse. Nora stepped out of the barn, rubbing her arms to stay warm. She had been up all night fixing the broken fence and checking on her horses. Life had been quiet for months, too quiet for someone who once lived through storms of men and guns. She thought she had left all that behind when she moved to this forgotten piece of land. The nearest town was 50 miles away, and the people there barely knew her name. She liked it that way. It gave her peace. But peace is something that doesn't last long in the wild country. As she looked out toward the horizon, she noticed something strange. There was a dark shape lying on the dirt road leading to her property. At first, she thought it might be an animal, maybe a coyote hit by one of the few passing trucks. But something inside her said it wasn't. She grabbed her old rifle out of habit, the one she had promised herself she'd never use again, and walked toward the figure. The wind carried a faint sound. It wasn't an animal's cry. It was a groan. Human. Weak. She hurried forward, boots crunching the gravel until she could see him clearly. He was lying face down, his coat soaked dark. When she turned him over, she saw the blood. 3 dark stains across his chest, each one deep and ugly. He was breathing, but barely. His lips moved, trying to speak, but only a faint sound came out. "Don't move," Nora said softly, kneeling beside him. "You'll make it worse." He looked at her through half-open eyes, pain shadowing his face. He was maybe in his mid-30s, his hair dark with dust and blood. She could tell from his clothes he wasn't just any wanderer. The badge half torn from his belt said everything, a detective. For a moment she froze. A wounded lawman was trouble. Someone who carried a badge carried stories, and those stories always brought danger. But she couldn't leave him there to die. Not when he was still breathing, still fighting. She lifted his head gently, whispering to him to stay awake. He tried to speak again, and this time she heard a single word. Run from what?" she asked. But he had already lost consciousness. Nora glanced around, her eyes scanning the open road. There was no one in sight, just the long stretch of land and the quiet hills beyond. She couldn't risk leaving him out there. With great effort, she dragged him toward the barn, every step heavy with his weight and the sound of his labored breathing. Inside, she laid him on a pile of hay, tore open his shirt, and saw the real damage. 3 bullet holes close enough to his heart to kill most men. Whoever shot him had meant to finish the job. She found her old medical kit, cleaned the wounds as best she could, and pressed bandages against the bleeding. He groaned again but didn't wake. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You've made it this far. Don't you quit on me now." She worked for hours, stopping the bleeding and stitching what she could with unsteady hands. The smell of blood mixed with the dusty air of the barn, and her heart pounded with every breath he took. When she finally stepped back, her arms were shaking. He was alive, but just barely. When the first light of dawn crept over the hills, Nora stepped outside to wash her hands in the water trough. The world was turning gold, and the silence felt heavy. Something in her gut told her this man's trouble was not far behind him. She didn't even know his name, but she could feel that whoever had done this would come looking. People don't shoot a detective and just walk away. She went back inside and sat beside him. He was sweating now, his face pale, but his breathing was steadier. She looked at the badge again, running her fingers over the letters. The name was faint, but she could make it out. Detective Miles Carter. "Miles," she whispered, "what did you get yourself into?" The day grew brighter, and she tried to go about her chores, but her mind kept returning to the wounded man. She thought about taking her truck into town for help, but that would take hours, and moving him could kill him. For now, all she could do was wait and keep him alive. As the hours passed, Miles began to stir. His eyes opened slowly, confused and clouded. He looked around, trying to sit up, but pain shot through his chest, forcing him to lie back down. "You're safe," Nora said quickly, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You're on my land. Don't try to move." He blinked at her, trying to focus. Where am I?" "Near Redstone Valley. You were half dead on my road." He frowned, his memory struggling to return. "They're coming," he said weakly. "You have to leave this place." "Who's coming?" she asked again, more firmly this time. He looked at her with tired eyes. "Oil Baron's men, they think I took something from them." She felt her stomach twist. She had heard about the Oil Baron, a ruthless man who controlled half the land and all the oil rights for miles around. He had his own private army, men who carried rifles and rode like they owned the world. People whispered that he dealt with problems quietly. No police, no courts, just bullets. "What did you take?" she asked, but he didn't answer. He had already drifted back into sleep. Nora stood up and went to the barn door, staring out at the open land. The morning was beautiful, but beneath that beauty was a sense of danger she couldn't shake. She thought about leaving, packing up and driving far away. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had left enough people behind in her life already. Instead, she checked her rifle, cleaned the barrel, and loaded it. She told herself it was only for protection, but deep down she knew it was more than that. Something inside her refused to run this time. She kept watch through the day, eyes always on the horizon. The detective slept in and out of pain, whispering names she didn't recognize. When the sun started to set, the sky turned red like spilled wine, and far off in the distance she saw it, a line of dust rising against the evening light. Riders. Her heart tightened as she counted them. 5, maybe 6. They were still miles away, but they were coming straight down the road. Nora stepped back into the barn and looked at Miles, still unconscious. She tightened her grip on the rifle. Whatever this man had done, whoever those riders were, they were coming for him. And by dawn, she would have to decide whether to stand her ground or run again. The night was long for Nora. She did not sleep even for a moment. The wind howled across the valley, brushing the dry grass and shaking the old barn doors. Inside, the lantern light flickered over the wounded detective lying motionless on the hay. His breathing was uneven, but he was alive. That was all she could ask for now. Every few minutes she would walk to the small window, look out into the darkness, and check the road. The riders she saw before sunset had not reached yet, but she knew they would. It was only a matter of time. She tried to think of what to do. Running was possible, but it meant leaving behind everything she had built here. Her horses, her small herd, her crops, and the peace she had fought so hard to find. Still, part of her wanted to escape before it was too late. Then she looked at the detective again. His face was pale, covered with dust and pain, but there was strength under all that suffering. He had risked his life for something. She just didn't know what. She sighed softly, took a deep breath, and sat down beside him. When she touched his forehead, he stirred again, whispering something she couldn't understand. She leaned closer. "Water," he muttered weakly. She quickly poured water into a tin cup and lifted his head carefully, letting him drink small sips. His eyes opened halfway. Where am I?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. "Safe for now," Nora said softly. "You're at my farm. Nobody's found you yet." He blinked slowly, trying to remember. "My name, Miles Carter. I was following a trail. Something about the oil baron. A deal gone wrong. I needed proof." Nora nodded. "And they found you before you could leave." He nodded slightly, grimacing from pain. "They think I have something that belongs to them. But I don't. I only know the truth, and then that's worse for them." She frowned. "Then why come this way?" "I had nowhere else to go. Someone told me about this valley, said it was quiet, no one around. I thought I could hide long enough to send word." "Send word to who?" she asked, but his eyes were already closing again. He was too weak to speak more. Nora sat there for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. The more she learned, the more uneasy she felt. She knew how powerful the oil baron was. He ruled the land like a king, and those who stood against him disappeared quietly. No sheriff dared to touch him. No judge dared to question him. As the night dragged on, the clouds moved away and the stars came out. The moonlight spilled across the land, turning the valley silver. Nora stood at the barn door again, her rifle in hand. Somewhere far in the distance, she heard faint sounds, the soft echo of hooves. They were coming. She took a deep breath and went back to the detective. "Miles," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Wake up, they're close." His eyes opened slightly. "How many?" 5 or 6 riders. Maybe more behind them." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to sit up, but pain stopped him halfway. She helped him lean against the wall. His hand reached for the revolver on his belt, but it was empty. Nora had taken it away when she first brought him in. "Don't," she said quietly. "You're too weak to fight." He gave her a tired smile. "You don't know these men. They won't stop," she nodded. "I believe you." That's why we need to be ready. For a moment, he just looked at her as if seeing something familiar. You've handled a gun before. Nora looked away. A long time ago. Different life. Miles gave a faint nod. You've still got that look. Someone who's seen more than she wanted to. She didn't answer. She only checked the rifle again and peered through the window. The dust trail was closer now, clear under the moonlight. The riders reached the main road and slowed as they saw the farmhouse. Their silhouettes moved like shadows, quiet, cautious. One of them raised a hand, signaling the others. Nora's heart pounded. She put out the lantern so the barn went dark, only the faint glow of moonlight guiding her steps. Miles tried to whisper, "You should go. Leave me here." "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. He shook his head. "You don't even know me. I don't need to. You're hurt and someone has to stand between you and them." She said it simply, but her voice carried something heavy, the sound of a promise she didn't plan to break. The first rider reached the fence line and stopped. He called out, his voice echoing across the field. "We're looking for someone. A man. Seen anyone pass this way?" Nora didn't answer. She stayed still, watching. Another voice, deeper and colder, spoke next. "If she's hiding him, we'll burn this place down." Nora felt a chill. She looked at Miles, his jaw tightened. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the oil baron's man, Clay Morton. He leads the group." The riders waited, listening. When no one answered, they began to move closer, spreading out. Nora took a deep breath and raised the rifle, aiming toward the fence. She didn't plan to use it unless she had to, but she needed them to think she wasn't afraid. Then she shouted, her voice strong and steady. "This land's private. You've got no reason to be here." There was silence. The riders stopped again. The one in front chuckled darkly. "Ma'am, we're only looking for a man. Hurt, bleeding, might have passed through here. Help us out and we'll be on our way." Nora's hands were steady on the rifle. "No one came this way," she said firmly. "Now turn around before I let the dogs loose." She didn't have any dogs, but they didn't need to know that. There was a long pause. Then Clay Morton said quietly, "You sure about that? See, I don't like liars. And my boss, he likes them even less." Nora stayed silent. Clay turned his horse slowly, pretending to give up, but she could tell from his posture he wasn't leaving. He was testing her. Finally, the riders backed off a little, turning their horses away. Nora waited until they disappeared into the darkness before lowering the rifle. Her hands trembled slightly now that the danger had passed, or at least she thought it had. Miles exhaled with difficulty. "You bought us some time. Time for what?" He looked at her, his expression grim. "They'll be back at dawn. They'll bring more men." She felt her chest tighten. Dawn was only a few hours away. Nora looked around the barn. Her supplies, her tools, her horses. She had lived here for years, keeping to herself, trying to forget everything she had once been. But now the past had found her again in the shape of a wounded detective and the shadow of a powerful man. She went to the window once more. The stars were fading. A thin line of pale light had started to rise in the east. "We'll have to move him," she whispered. "If they come back, they'll search every corner." Miles shook his head weakly. "You can't move me far." "I won't make it." Nora clenched her jaw. "Then we'll find another way. There's an old cellar under the barn. No one knows about it." With slow, careful effort, she lifted him again and guided him down the narrow steps to the hidden space below. It was dark, filled with old barrels and boxes, but it would do. When she came back up, the first rays of morning light touched the land. The wind carried the distant sound of horses again, louder this time, heavier. Miles was right. The oil baron's men were coming back. Nora loaded her rifle once more and looked toward the rising sun. She had faced storms before. She would face this one too. The first light of dawn spread across the valley, painting the land in pale gold. The air was still and cool, but Nora could already feel the weight of what was coming. She stood by the barn window holding her rifle, her heart steady but heavy. The faint sound of hooves came again, echoing through the quiet morning. She knew they were close. Down in the cellar, the detective, Miles, lay half awake. His breathing was slow, his body weak, but his mind was clear. He could hear the distant rhythm of horses, and it made his stomach tighten. He knew what that sound meant. It meant the oil baron's men were coming, and this time they wouldn't leave without finding him. Nora checked her rifle one more time and looked toward the horizon. A thin cloud of dust rose in the distance. There were more riders now, at least a dozen, maybe more. She could see their shapes moving steadily through the golden mist. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Her thoughts drifted back to the life she once had, the small town she had left behind, the people she had known, and the things she had done to survive. There was a time when she had sworn she would never hold a gun again. But life had its own plans. She turned toward the cellar door and called softly, "Miles, they're coming." His faint voice came from below. "You should go while you can." Nora shook her head even though he couldn't see her. "Not this time. I'm not running." There was silence for a moment, then a weak reply. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "Someone who didn't give up either." Nora didn't answer. She stepped outside the barn, squinting against the growing light. The riders were close enough now for her to see the glint of their saddles and the dust on their coats. The man leading them, Clay Morton, sat tall on his dark horse. He was dressed in a long coat, and even from a distance she could see the cold confidence in his posture. They reached the edge of her fence and slowed down. Clay lifted his hat slightly in a false gesture of politeness. "Morning, ma'am," he called out. "We came back because we didn't get to thank you properly last night." Nora kept her rifle down but didn't smile. "You should have stayed gone," she said evenly. Clay chuckled. "Oh, we would have. But the man we're looking for, he's too important to leave behind." "You sure you haven't seen him?" "I already told you last night," she replied. "No one came through here." He nodded slowly, pretending to believe her. "Funny thing," he said. "We found some tracks down the road. Fresh ones. Looked like someone dragging another man." Nora didn't move. Her heart pounded, but her face stayed calm. "Could have been anyone. I get travelers sometimes." Clay tilted his head. "Out here? 50 miles from the nearest town?" She met his gaze without blinking. "Sometimes lost men find their way to the wrong place." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He turned to the men behind him. "Search the property." At those words, Nora stepped forward, raising her rifle slightly. "You're not stepping past that fence," she warned. Clay looked amused. "You really want to make this hard, ma'am? I don't enjoy troubling good people, but my boss doesn't like loose ends. If that detective's here and you're helping him, that makes you a loose end." Nora's grip tightened on the rifle. "You'll find nothing here but trouble." For a moment, no one moved. The air felt heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Even the horses pawed the ground restlessly. Then Clay gave a slow nod and 2 of his men dismounted. They started walking toward the barn. Nora fired once, not to hit them, but close enough to the ground that dust flew up around their boots. "Next one won't miss," she said firmly. Clay held up his hand, signaling his men to stop. His eyes narrowed. "You've got spirit, ma'am. I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered." "Maybe," she replied. "But I'm not the one standing in someone else's yard." The silence stretched again, long and sharp. Clay studied her for a few seconds, then smiled thinly. "You've got until sundown," he said. "If I come back and find anything you're hiding, this place will burn to the ground. Think about that, ma'am." He turned his horse, and the riders followed, leaving a trail of dust behind. Nora watched them until they disappeared over the hill. Only then did she lower her rifle and let out a long breath. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of keeping them steady. She went back into the barn and opened the cellar door. Miles looked up at her weakly. "They'll be back, won't they?" "Yes," she said. "By sundown." He struggled to sit up. "Then we have to end this before they do." Nora frowned.
"End this how?"
"There's something I have. Or rather, something they think I have." He reached for the inside pocket of his torn coat and pulled out a small metal case, no bigger than a notebook. It was dented and covered in blood, but still sealed. "This," he said. "Inside is a list of names. People who took money from the oil baron, politicians, lawmen, bankers. It's enough to destroy him if it ever reaches the right hands." Nora stared at the case. "Then that's why they want you." Miles nodded. "I was supposed to deliver it to a contact in Redstone City, but they found out before I could leave." She took the case from him, feeling the weight of it. "So if we get this to your contact, this all ends?" He nodded again, his face pale but determined. "Maybe not for me, but for everyone else he's hurt. It could be enough to stop him." Nora thought for a moment. "Redstone's a long way. Too far for you to travel like this." "I can't go," he said quietly. "But you can." She looked down at him. "You're asking me to take something that could get me killed." "I'm asking you to do what's right," he said softly. She hesitated. looking at the small case again. She didn't want to be part of this. She didn't want to fight anyone's war. But deep inside, she knew she couldn't stand aside either. She had lived too long pretending that doing nothing was safe. She sighed. "All right, I'll go." Miles managed a weak smile. "You'll need to leave before sundown." "They'll come back for sure." "I know," she said, "but I'm not leaving you here unprotected." "There's an old trail north of the valley," he whispered. "If you follow it past the cliffs, there's a small cabin. I have a friend there, Sheriff Dawes. He can help." Nora nodded. "I'll get you there." He looked at her in surprise. "You can't move me that far." "I've moved heavier things," she said with a faint smile. As the sun rose higher, Nora began to prepare. She packed food, water, and medicine. She saddled her strongest horse, a brown mare named Willow, and checked the wagon that she hadn't used in months. Every sound outside made her tense. Every shadow made her heart quicken. By noon, Miles was ready enough to move. She helped him onto the wagon carefully, making sure he was lying flat and hidden under a blanket. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. "You sure about this?" he asked. She nodded. "I've made up my mind." They began moving slowly across the open land, the wagon wheels creaking softly. The valley stretched around them, wide and silent. In the distance, birds circled high in the sky. Nora glanced back often, watching the road behind. She knew time was short. By the time the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the hills cast long shadows across the sand. The wagon climbed the rocky path toward the northern trail. Miles drifted in and out of sleep, his breathing shallow. As the wind picked up, Nora thought she heard something, faint but clear, the distant thunder of hooves. She turned sharply and saw it, a line of riders far behind following their trail. Her heart raced. They had found them. She gripped the reins tighter and urged the horse forward. The wagon jolted over rocks, dust rising around them. Miles opened his eyes weakly, understanding without words. "They're coming," he said. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But they'll have to catch us first." The sun touched the horizon, turning the sky red. The road ahead was rough, but Nora didn't slow down. Behind them, the oil baron's riders grew closer, their figures dark against the burning light of evening. The chase had begun. The desert stretched endlessly in front of Nora, the sun dipping lower with each passing moment. The wagon creaked and jolted over the rocky path, and every time the wheels hit a bump, Miles groaned in pain. She leaned close to him, adjusting the blanket to keep him steady. "They're still behind us," Miles whispered, his voice weak but urgent. "I can hear them." Nora nodded without turning. She could see the dust clouds far in the distance rising like ghosts against the orange sky. They weren't stopping, and they wouldn't, not until they had him, or the evidence he carried. The trail narrowed, weaving between low cliffs and jagged rocks. It was treacherous for the wagon, but Nora knew it better than anyone. Years of living in the valley had taught her every stone, every slope, every hidden path. "Hold on," she said, gripping the reins tighter. She urged the horse forward. Willow's hooves clattered against the hard ground, but she moved steadily, strong and fast. Miles tried to sit up, his face pale with pain. "You can't keep this pace much longer," he said, wincing. "We don't have the luxury to slow down," Nora replied, her voice steady. "If we stop, they'll catch us." He nodded, understanding. He closed his eyes and let the wagon ride over the rough ground. Every jolt made his wounds ache, but he refused to speak of it. He knew they had to reach the northern cabin before nightfall. The trail climbed sharply, the cliffs rising around them. Nora navigated carefully, her hands tight on the reins, eyes scanning the road ahead. One wrong turn and the wagon could tip. She couldn't afford mistakes. Behind them, the dust clouds grew larger, and she could hear faint shouts carried on the wind. The riders were close. One misstep and they would be surrounded. "Take the next fork," Miles said quietly, pointing to a narrow path on the left. "It's a hidden trail. Less known. It leads to an old mining road. It's rough, but they'll slow down if they follow it." Nora glanced at him. "How do you know this?" "I used to patrol here," he replied weakly. "Years ago. It's the only way we can get some distance," she nodded. Without a word, she turned the wagon toward the left fork. The path was narrow, overgrown with scrub and lined with jagged rocks. Willow moved carefully, but every time her hooves struck a stone, it sent a shiver up Nora's spine. She prayed the wagon would hold together. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the desert floor. The riders were gaining, their horses moving faster than they should over such rough terrain. Nora knew they would try to push through. They were ruthless and experienced. She looked back again and saw Clay Morton urging his horse forward. He was focused, cold, and determined, just as Miles had warned. Nora felt a pang of fear, but she swallowed it. Fear wasn't going to save them. Only skill, knowledge, and courage could. Hours passed as they moved along the hidden trail. Every sound made Nora tense. The whistle of the wind, the cry of a distant bird, the creak of the wagon. She scanned the horizon constantly, knowing the riders could emerge from any path, any cliff at any moment. "We can't go much further before night," Miles said after a while, his voice weak. "We need a place to hide, even if just for a few hours. There's a dry creek bed ahead, rocks and brush. They won't see us easily," Nora nodded. "Lead the way." They reached the creek bed, narrow and filled with jagged stones. Nora eased the wagon down carefully, letting Willow pick her way slowly. Miles winced at every bump, but she didn't stop. She guided the wagon between boulders and hidden curves until they reached a small shaded area behind a rise. "It's not much," she said, breathing heavily. "But they won't see us until morning." Miles nodded, closing his eyes. "Good enough," he said quietly. Nora tied Willow to a nearby bush, then moved some rocks to create a small screen for the wagon. She wanted them to remain completely hidden. Every sense was alert, listening, watching, feeling the tension in the air. The wind shifted, carrying faint sounds from behind. The riders were searching now, spreading out, shouting, scanning the land. Nora held her breath, counting quietly. None had found them yet. She slipped inside the wagon, kneeling beside Miles. "You need to rest," she said softly. "We'll be safe here until night is fully gone." He nodded weakly. "I just hope our luck holds." Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the wagon or the distant sound of hooves. Nora couldn't sleep. Every time her eyes closed, she imagined the riders finding them, the wagon overturning, and Miles's life ending before they could reach safety. She thought about the small cabin Miles had mentioned, the friend who could help. Every second counted. They had to reach it before dawn, before the riders could surround them again. As night deepened, the desert air grew colder. Nora wrapped Miles in extra blankets, keeping him warm. She stayed awake, listening to every sound, feeling every movement in the dark. She didn't let herself relax, not even for a moment. Finally, when the sky was dark and the moon rose, she decided they had to move again. They couldn't wait for daylight. The riders would sweep the area as soon as the sun rose. "Time to go," she whispered. Miles opened his eyes, weak but alert. "Are you sure?" "I have to try," she said. "We'll follow the old mining road." "You said it leads to the cabin?" "Yes," he replied, forcing a faint smile. "It's rough but faster than staying here." Nora climbed back onto Willow and guided the wagon carefully onto the narrow mining road. The path was rocky, uneven, and dangerous. Every turn could have sent the wagon tumbling. But Willow was steady, and Nora's hands were sure. Behind them, faint dust clouds rose again. The riders had found their previous trail and were following. Nora didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She focused on the road ahead, every bend, every shadow. Miles groaned with each bump, but he held on. "You're amazing," he whispered. "I don't know how you're doing this." "I have no choice," Nora said quietly. "If we stop, we lose everything." The road twisted around cliffs and small valleys. They moved slowly but steadily. Hours passed. Nora knew they were pushing both themselves and the horse to the limit, but she refused to slow down. Safety was ahead, she hoped, but she couldn't see it yet. Finally, in the early hours before dawn, the faint outline of trees appeared in the distance. Miles's face brightened slightly. "That's it," he whispered. "That's where the cabin is." Nora's heart lifted. Relief surged, but she didn't celebrate yet. They still had to get there, and the riders were close. She slowed the wagon slightly, guiding it through the last stretch of rough terrain. The trees became larger, more numerous, and offered cover. She could feel the tension ease a little, knowing they were almost there. Suddenly, she heard the faint sound of hooves behind them, closer than before. The riders had gained speed. "They're here," Miles said softly, fear in his voice. Nora didn't respond. She tightened her grip, urging Willow forward with all her strength. The wagon bumped and jolted, but she refused to stop. Every second counted. At last they reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, hidden among thick trees. Nora guided the wagon carefully toward it. The cabin door opened and a figure appeared. A man in a sheriff's uniform, alert and ready. "Quickly," Miles called, his voice weak but urgent. Nora guided the wagon behind the cabin, shielding it from view. She lifted Miles gently, helping him into the cabin while she checked the surroundings. Dust clouds in the distance told her the riders had seen the trees and were approaching, but the thick branches would slow them down. Inside, Miles collapsed onto a cot, exhausted but alive. The sheriff moved to help him, examining the wounds carefully. Nora stepped back, catching her breath. "We made it," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "We made it." Miles smiled faintly, gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks to you," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." Nora allowed herself a small smile. For now, they were safe, but she knew the danger was far from over. The oil baron's men were out there, and this night was only the beginning. The small cabin was quiet, except for the soft groans of Miles as he tried to settle onto the cot. The sheriff moved quickly, checking his wounds and wrapping bandages more securely. Nora leaned against the wall, exhausted, her body aching from hours of guiding the wagon and keeping both herself and Miles alive. Outside, the desert was calm. The dust clouds from the riders had disappeared behind the trees, and the sounds of hooves faded into silence. But Nora knew it was temporary. The oil baron's men would not give up. They had power, resources, and a determination that came from years of taking what they wanted. Miles opened his eyes weakly. "How far are we from the town?" he asked. "About 10 miles, Nora replied. "You can't walk that far in your condition. The sheriff can keep you safe here for now." Miles looked at the sheriff. "Can you hide me?" "Just until the evidence gets to someone who can make it count." The sheriff nodded. "I've hidden men before. They'll never find you here, but we'll need to move quickly when the time comes." Nora turned away, thinking about what she could do. She didn't know much about Miles's plan, but she understood one thing clearly. If the evidence fell into the wrong hands, everything they had risked would be for nothing. She stepped outside for a moment, feeling the morning air on her face. The sun was climbing, the sky clear, and the world seemed peaceful. It was a stark contrast to the danger they had just escaped. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine life after all of this, quiet, safe, and far from the oil baron's shadow. But that was only a dream. Reality was waiting, and it would not wait for her. Returning inside, she helped Miles drink water and eat a little food. Every movement caused him pain, but he insisted on being alert. "We can't wait too long," he said. "If the oil baron's men regroup, they'll find another way." "They never quit," Nora nodded. "Then we move tonight before anyone can track us. We'll get the evidence to Redstone City." The sheriff spoke quietly. "I'll help, but you'll need a clear path. The oil baron has eyes everywhere. Any mistake could cost you both your lives." Miles smiled faintly. "I've learned that the hard way, but we have no choice." As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, Nora began preparing for the journey. She packed food, blankets, water, and the metal case containing the evidence. The sheriff offered to guide them through hidden paths that were less known, paths that would take hours but kept them away from any road where the oil baron's men could find them. Nora guided Willow toward the hidden trail. Miles lay in the wagon, weak but determined. Every jolt caused pain, but he gritted his teeth and refused to complain. Hours passed and the desert grew colder as night fell. Nora kept her eyes on the path, scanning for any sign of movement. The moon was high, casting silver light on the rocks and sand, but it did little to reveal danger. Suddenly a faint sound reached her ears, the soft but unmistakable rhythm of hooves. She froze, listening carefully. "They've found us again," Miles whispered, his voice strained. Nora's heart raced. "Stay down. Don't make a sound." Through the trees she could see dark shapes moving. It was Clay Morton and a few riders, tracking them with precision. They were faster now, more determined. But Nora had one advantage, the narrow path in the trees. They couldn't ride as fast, and she knew the road better. She guided the wagon carefully, taking sharp turns, dodging rocks, and using every obstacle to slow the riders. Dust rose behind them, but Nora kept her focus. Every second counted. Miles looked at her, pain in his eyes. "You've done the impossible so far." "I'm not done yet," she said firmly. We're getting there. The riders tried to push forward, shouting directions and urging their horses faster. But the path became narrower, lined with rocks and thick brush. Nora used every inch of it to her advantage, forcing them to slow down. Hours passed and the wagon finally approached a small bridge over a dry creek. Nora guided Willow carefully across. The bridge creaked under the weight, but it held. The riders had to wait, unable to cross as quickly. She allowed herself a small sigh of relief, but she knew it was temporary. They still had miles to go before reaching the safe house in Redstone City. Finally, the cabin she had been told about appeared in the distance. A small, simple structure hidden by trees and shadows. The sheriff's friend, a man named Dawes, stood at the door waiting. Nora guided the wagon to a hidden spot behind the cabin. She helped Miles down gently, keeping him low and covered. The sheriff and Dawes quickly moved to provide extra protection. "They'll be coming," Dawes said quietly. "But we've prepared for this. We'll keep you hidden." Miles nodded, exhaustion evident on his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Nora shook her head. "We're not safe yet. The evidence still needs to get to the right hands." The sheriff stepped outside to scout the area. Nora stayed with Miles, checking his breathing and making sure he was as comfortable as possible. Every shadow outside made her tense, every faint sound made her alert. Hours passed. The night was quiet, the desert calm. But Nora knew the silence was temporary. They couldn't stay here forever. The oil baron's men would search every road, every trail, every valley until they found them. Finally, when the early morning light touched the trees, Nora made a decision. "It's time," she said. "We have to move now." Miles looked at her, weak but determined. "I'm ready," he said. The sheriff and Dawes helped guide them along a hidden path toward the main road leading to Redstone City. The journey was slow, careful, and tense. Nora kept Willow moving steadily, using every skill she had to avoid detection. Hours later, the city appeared in the distance, lights glowing faintly in the early morning. Relief washed over Nora. They had done it. They had survived the desert, the riders, and the relentless pursuit. Miles smiled faintly, looking at the city. "We made it," he whispered. Nora nodded. "For now. But the evidence still needs to reach the right people." With the sheriff's guidance, they approached a safe house in the city, a place where the evidence could be delivered to journalists and officials who could act without fear. Miles handed over the small metal case, his hands shaking slightly. Nora watched as the case was taken inside. It represented hope, justice, and the possibility of stopping the oil baron once and for all. Finally, after weeks of fear, danger, and relentless pursuit, Nora allowed herself a moment to breathe. They had survived. They had protected the detective. They had delivered the evidence. Miles looked at her with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said softly. Nora smiled faintly. "You didn't have to, I just couldn't let him die." For the first time in a long while, the weight on her shoulders lifted. The city was quiet, the streets empty in the early morning. The sun rose higher, spreading light over the buildings, the roads, and the world they had fought to protect. The oil baron's men would not stop easily. But now there was hope. There was proof. There was a chance for justice. Nora walked away from the safe house, Willow following beside her. She looked at the rising sun, feeling the warmth on her face. For the first time in years, she felt the peace she had been searching for. She had faced danger, betrayal, and fear. She had risked everything to protect a stranger who had needed her. And in the end, they had survived. The world was still full of threats, full of men like the oil baron. But Nora had learned something important: courage, determination, and doing what is right, even when it seems impossible, can change everything. As she rode through the quiet streets, she knew one thing for certain: she would never run again. And for the first time in a long while, she felt free.